Hello, and today I introduce you to my exceptional guest. He is Richard Levick. He is the chairman and CEO of Levick. And Richard, I thought before I introduce you, I'll read a little about you. He is and represents countries and companies in the highest stakes global crises, public affairs matters, and litigation, etc. So, a very warm welcome, Richard Levick.
Well, Nadia, thank you so much. And I can't wait to hear what the et cetera is. I'm sure at some point I'll learn, but thank you.
Well, you have to be able to fill in the etc. So, can I ask you, when it comes to Thanksgiving and holidays, we're in the holiday spirit, as you can see from our background. How do you, Richard, introduce yourself to people?
Well, first of all, holidays are a famous time for us getting those crisis calls. It's Christmas Eve, it's the Friday after Thanksgiving, or sometimes it's the Thursday, it's July 4th. It is often on the holidays that we get those calls. But in terms of an introduction, we handle the highest profile crises in the world, representing countries and companies in matters when everything's at stake.
So it's interesting you say those calls. And have you got a particular story of where it was a holiday or a Christmas and there you were with your family and that call came in?
Well, there's just so many of them, but Christmas Eve, just a year ago, got a call about, of all things, romance writers of America. And you would think the romance writers, I mean, everyone must love each other. But, what's happened there in that industry is that people used to get these $100,000 advances, make a good living at it. And now, because you can get books so easily and often for free, the bottoms dropped out of that. That's right. The bottoms dropped out of the industry. And so there was an attack from inside. Inside the organization, and it went online very quickly. And as we often are, we were called, unfortunately, a little bit late. And it's how do you put the toothpaste back in the tube? And we'll get to the importance of prophylactic in a minute. But what people often ask me, what's the most dangerous place on the planet? I mean, you're in war-torn areas, you're followed by spies in the Middle East, you're handling the Gulf oil spill, you're handling Guantanamo Bay. What's the most dangerous place in the world? And I always say Twitter. It's by far the most dangerous place because everyone has a platform, everyone has the opportunity to share their opinions and their anger, no matter if it's bereft of fact or not.
So, Richard, it's a holiday. You get this call inside the romance writers. Somebody's attacking someone, which isn't good for the reputation of romance writers. What happens? How do you deal with it?
Well, as in all situations, the first things you need to do is you need to gather your intelligence. You need to understand what the facts are, what's really happened, the chronology. And we often recommend, let's do a pictorial chronology. And the reason you want to do that is you want everyone to be able to see, we're visual learners. You want to see the order in which things have happened. When we handled the Gulf oil spill, not for BP, but for another major global player who was involved, the first 2 days were spent in doing the chronology, understanding what the liabilities were, all of the facts. And in that case, my favorite moment, I'm a lawyer by training. We work with the large law firms all over the world. The lead lawyer for this client in the Gulf oil spill, by day 2, when all the facts were gathered, he said, this is what my legal strategy should be. This is what I'm recommending. And then my 5 favorite words, he said, tell me why I'm stupid. And that was, he was asking people from investor relations, government relations, communications, brand, all the other divisions, the silos within the company and outside consultants. If you have a reason why, or you identify exposure that's greater than the $1 billion I can save from this legal strategy, then you lead and we'll sacrifice legal. If not, legal will lead. And it's understanding what the facts are, what the liability is, and then oftentimes what you have to sacrifice in order to get the crisis behind you.
How much of the story has changed? When you started, you were a lawyer, you went into crisis communications. It was pre-social media the way it is today. So you spoke about Twitter being the most dangerous place. How different is it? And for you in crisis communication, what advice and guidance do you have to everybody who's listening right now? If you're in a company, what do you need to know so that you prevent that explosion on Twitter?
Well, Nadia, first of all, you're very kind. I didn't get in pre-social media. I got in pre-Gutenberg. I've been at this for a while. But the biggest change that I've seen is we've gone from the reactive, which is what we have known for 70 years now, to the proactive. And by that, what I mean is companies, boards, organizations, countries, you wait for the crisis to happen and then you have time to react. That's no longer true. You have to track and understand what the trends are before they happen so you are prepared. Take a look at United. So you have Oscar Munoz, who is an extraordinary CEO, was the former CEO of CSX, handled derailments, including with toxic materials, understood how to handle crises. And yet the crisis, the famous violent exiting of Dr. Dow off that plane in Chicago, picked up by two people on their phones, goes around the world. He doesn't appreciate until that Wednesday what they need to do. And no one on the Sunday when it occurred was tracking social media. So by Monday, when he's first learning about it, the narrative globally has already been written. Companies have to be proactive.
So it's interesting, Richard. Do people hire you proactively, or do they only hire you when there's a crisis?
Unfortunately, most of the time they hire us reactively and they ask us to come in and work magic. Let's unwind this somehow. Truth is, interestingly, it's not something that we come to through some epistemology, that is this Socratic method of learning information. Truth is what we learn first. What we read first, we think that must be true. I mean, we're having this argument about masks right now and vaccines. It's because for a lot of people, well, they've heard first that they're not safe or that it's not helpful. Once you believe something to be true, trying to undo it is much harder. The other thing, though, and where it has a huge impact is, we handled Surfside, that tragic collapse, the condo collapse in Florida. If you look at the first 2.5 days of stories before we got involved, most of the media was blaming the board of directors. Once we had over 500 conversations individually with journalists to correct the records and provide them with facts, the story narratives changed in terms of who might be to blame. Now, that's important, obviously, from a media point of view, if you're a company, from a brand point of view, from a stock point of view. But if you're a potential defendant, that's a huge impact because it takes you out of the line of fire from being the first in line with deep pockets.
So when we look at, and I want to have as many examples as possible, let's say Avon, Radio Shack, BlackBerry, let's unpack those. How did they handle the crises? How did they handle things being maybe misconceived? And then again, what advice and guidance do you have for other companies in bulletproofing themselves?
So it's a fascinating question because, the crisis examples we've talked about so far, the Gulf oil spill, the United situation, Surfside, those were all instantaneous crises. The ones you're talking about are slow moving. I mean, look at these companies. Avon, they virtually invented two-income families back in the 50s at a time when women were largely at home, working at home as homemakers. And I'm reporting this, as fact, not as opinion, in terms of, not trying to be sexist here, but that was the division in the marketplace. And Avon creates the opportunity to work from home. They could not envision a future when it became two-income families. Ding dong, Avon calling no longer became a clarion call for opportunity, but in fact, something that seemed ancient. No one was home for people to sell their products. If you look at BlackBerry, they owned 86% of the cell phone market, of the PDA market, when they first started. And they thought that they had never been breached. There had been no cyber incidents, so their security system was excellent. And they had the raised keyboard. they thought that was enough to maintain dominance in the marketplace. A couple of years ago, I was guest lecturing at a university, and I asked these undergraduate students, how many of you use BlackBerry? No hands went up. But then I asked, how many of you have heard of BlackBerry? No hands went up. And this was for a company that had just a few years earlier, controlled 86% of the market. Radio Shack is fascinating because they come up 30 years before Apple. They have the first Genius Bar. That's where Wozniak and Jobs went to buy their first computer, and yet they missed the computer generation. Who goes to Radio Shack?
Why? What could they have done differently?
Because just like Kodak, who also owned the patent on digital photography, we get too comfortable with success. And, telling truth to power, the marketplace is changing. Look, when the AIG crisis occurred, that's happening so quickly that it's hard to tell truth to power, but you got to change really, really quickly. But when you're looking at Kodak, when you're looking at Blockbuster, when you're looking at Avon, Radio Shack, these are companies that have years to figure it out, but they're too comfortable. And if we've learned anything in this century over the last, that is that market dominance doesn't guarantee anything. And I think the reason why Facebook is trying to switch to Meta is obviously all the crises that they've not handled well. That's a whole second show in and of itself. But that they're trying to reposition themselves for the future rather than stay comfortable with the present.
Reposition yourself for the future rather than stay comfortable with the present is so critical. So when we look at companies now who appear to be doing that, okay, Facebook, Meta, who appears to be doing that well, and we don't need to come up with the answers now, and if any of you are joining us, feel free to type it into our chat, is what companies are missing the boat somehow because they could be doing things differently.
So big question, obviously a big question. And let's first of all start with Meta or Facebook, which has not handled any of their crises well. And their repositioning right now, which is their second repositioning in 3 years, is based out of defensiveness. And that is, they know that Facebook is becoming a brand no longer embraced by the alpha generation.
Right.
Anybody
you
else
call it the alpha, millennial XYZ.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And so no longer being embraced, but also because they are becoming the sum total of all their missteps. People don't trust them anymore. And so they're trying to become something different. But if you're going to change, if you're going to shift, you have to be true to who you are. You have to be authentic. So companies that get it right, Nike, Starbucks, Apple. Look, Apple is the first company when laptops were new, they were the first company to put their brand on the outside of their laptops. Why? They knew that anyone who had already purchased this knew what they purchased. It was a way of saying, look, I'm part of your tribe. I'm a creative.
We had a conversation yesterday, Richard, and you said something that has resonated with me, is that we are now looking to companies to be a moral guide. We are expecting companies to have purpose. We're expecting companies to be focused on sustainability and getting their carbon footprint lower. Is that not another huge element of what companies are going to have to look at and do going forward?
Absolutely. That is just as we have to go from being reactive to proactive. We have to realize that our brand, and it doesn't matter if we're a B2B, business to business, B2G, business to government, we're all B2C, business to consumer. When Foxconn happened, who knew what Foxconn was, right? Or Takata. These are business to business companies that can count the number of clients they have on two hands because they're business to business. But they quickly became known as and thought of as consumer companies. So everyone's being impacted by this, and they need to be thinking about who their audience really is. You are now judged not just by what your brand is, but where you advertise, how you advertise, your supply chain, your DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, your
Generate
ESG,
that.
right? Everything matters. And that's a challenge for a lot of companies who are not used to it. Now let's look at some companies who are largely getting it right. And I think that if you look historically, most of the time, the silos, or the bastions that we look to religion, we look to government for leadership. But both of those tragically have lost trust over the last number of years. So increasingly we look for others. What was it that told us in America that COVID was serious and that we had to change radically? Was it the federal government? No. It was the NBA. When they canceled their season, all of a sudden last March, we thought, oh my God, this is serious. It was a company stepping into the lurch. 1909, in order to fight off a pending financial crisis, which would 20 years later would become the Great Depression, it was JP Morgan who stepped forward, the individual, invited all the bankers in New York, the large bankers, to his library, locked them in and said, we're not leaving until we solve this. And that's how the Federal Reserve was created. And I think we're sort of moving back where people are looking to companies to say, how are you going to fix this? Global warming, diversity. They're looking for companies to take leadership. Probably the most fascinating example. Look at Nike and its embrace of Colin Kaepernick. The NFL, the National Football League, right?
That they took a chance.
Well, they took an enormous chance. There's only one more powerful sports brand in the world other than the NFL, and it's the Premiership. So you've got this cabal of, 32 owners, and they have blackballed Colin Kaepernick. What does Nike do? And the NFL is a huge customer of theirs. They not only embrace him, they make him part of an enormous advertising campaign, the center of it. Why does that happen? One, they'd done it before. That is, they were the first with women athletes, the first with LGBT athletes in advertising, the first with African American minority athletes, the first with disabled, the first with women. So they were very comfortable with it. Two, they understood the why they're in business. They understood their tribe. Next, they were patient. They knew they would be heavily criticized. And this is where most companies make the mistake. Do you remember all the calls for boycotts, the burning of Nike shoes?
Very well. I was at CNN at the time. Very, very well.
What happens after 10 days? Boycotts get no traction whatsoever. And that's a reminder, most of the time, all these calls for boycotts, it's not like Cesar Chavez 50 years ago in the great boycotts, the lettuce boycotts. Most boycott calls today get ignored. So it's a huge lesson for companies. But most importantly, Nike knew where they were going. They were willing to sacrifice some customers for the larger market they were moving to. And if you look at the delta in terms of the billions of dollars in market share and value that occurred very soon after those first 10 days, Nike knew exactly what it was doing. It got the NFL to do a full retreat. They still haven't hired Colin Kaepernick back, but we no longer see them opposing kneeling or talking the way they were talking. They've embraced the Nike approach. There's a courage of your convictions benefited by knowing where the market is going, not where it is. And that's the single largest difference between the collateral damage on that road to perdition, which has companies like Radio Shack and Blockbuster.
For those people who've just joined us, I'm talking to crisis communication global expert Richard Levick, and I do want to say hello to Kumar Yousafzai. Thank you, Kumar, for sharing this with all the people that are in your community. Richard, we're talking about companies that deal with crisis, how to, and I like the word ramplify, because it's how do we ramp up and amplify going forward in this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment. And you've given us just excellent examples of where companies are going to have to be looking at things very differently and expanding and shifting mindset and acquiring skill set. In terms of when we look at just a crisis like Peloton faced, when Peloton had on their various machines, there were incidents. When you look at a situation like that, how do you think they handled it? Do you think they handled it well? I'm just hoping whoever's watching us can go, if my company does face that kind of crisis, how should I handle it? Do I admit fault? Do I immediately recall every treadmill? Another case of a crisis and what happened to their shares after that and what's happening now.
So first, for just to refresh people's memories, with Peloton, there were incidences with some of their devices either falling over.
Mainly treadmills.
The treadmills, they had small animals, pets were killed, some children were killed. And in defense of Peloton, I will say that they were going through an extraordinary market growth because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But then, pardon me, but then with when they first got word of the challenges that they were having in terms of some of these tragedies, they went to denial. And no recall, this is the consumer's fault. It really seemed to fall on deaf ears. There was delay. As bad and as challenging as a crisis may be, it's not going to get better by inaction. Crisis is not like wine. It doesn't age well. What you want to do is need to act quickly. You need to get ahead of it. And I think—
Can I pause there for a moment? It is understandable that when you watch the video of a child being caught under a Peloton treadmill, where was the parent? Did you not ask yourself that?
Well, one of the things that you want to be concerned about is finger pointing. It may be factual, but it doesn't play very well. 25 years ago, Ford Firestone, famous for the public finger pointing, and it ended up being a pox on both your houses. Where was the parent? But you're not going to win that argument with any parent who knows, I can't watch my child 24/7. And so you're telling me that if there's just a 2-minute period during the day when I'm not watching them, and every parent can be sympathetic to the fact that we can't be there all the time. And
just got another question: is a Peloton treadmill more lethal than any other treadmill?
Well, and that's a question not for me, but it's also not a question that's germane to the moment. The moment is the thing when whatever you want to do in a crisis is you want to fix it. You want to do it right. Look, 40 years ago, Johnson & Johnson and the Tylenol crisis. Jim Burke didn't know after 4.5 days when finally he overrode the FBI and he recalled all the over-the-counter pain medications, not just Tylenol. He overrides the FBI. He overrides all the financial analysts who didn't think they were going to survive. The best of all the reports that I've read was, well, they may survive, but certainly not become the leading brand in over-the-counter pain medications. Not just Tylenol, but all their over-the-counter pain medications, because the late Jim Burke, CEO of Johnson & Johnson at the time, wanted his customers to know our customers are more important than our profits. And Peloton sent the exact opposite message. The question is not what is the instant cost, but what can you gain if you're trusted? And that's why if you look at Starbucks handled the incident in Philadelphia with the two African—
Just remind us, yes.
Right. They said, we're going to suffer $16 million in profit losses on a half day by looking at diversity issues and unintended bias. We're going to fix or try or do our best to fix this, because they knew whatever the cost was would be more than made up for. And because they understand their brand is the third place, not the home, not the office. It's the third place. We want our third place to be sacred. Johnson & Johnson, by the way, the benefit of pulling their over-the-counter pain medications was, and the reason why the analysts were so critical was, well, it's going to cost you this quarter. If you look at the next 120 quarters, Johnson & Johnson almost always outperformed in the marketplace. And two, if you look at trust of pharmaceutical companies, up until the last 5 years, Johnson & Johnson was always separated in terms of trust from the other companies. And so the question is, how do you do the math? When you're looking at courage in a crisis, What numbers are you using? Are you using the short-term loss as a publicly traded stock? Are you looking at the long-term gains if you're going to be trusted? Because being a trusted brand here in the center of the forehead of purchasers is an extraordinary value that simply cannot be measured.
So when we look at individuals over the last while whose brands have been tarnished by how they handle things. So let's look at Aaron Rodgers. So you have this impression, this vision, this how he shows up in the minds of his fans. And now, if you had been working with Aaron Rodgers, how would you have handled things differently?
Well, forgive me. Take the vaccine, Roger. Take the vaccine. Let's, and that's a whole separate conversation.
Yes.
But, part of our tragedy as critics is that it's in sports, it's all about winning. In companies, it's all about profits. So if, the Green Bay Packers are having an extraordinary year, it's amazing how quick everything is going to be forgiven for the fact that, what are they, 8-2, 9-1? They're one of the favorite teams now to win the Super Bowl. That's going to be enough for him. And, you think back to basketball coaches who threw chairs when they were disgruntled with the referees. Winning records forgive a lot of errors.
So we're talking crisis communication. We're talking about dealing with things when they don't work out. We're talking about companies who are hacked. And how do they immediately send out the right message that we're taking care of this? So as we wrap up today, our advice to each and every individual who is leading a company, who at some time or another may be faced by a crisis or criticism, be it fair or unfair, Richard, because in an age of social media, you can be lambasted on social media and it is the court of public opinion. So just final words of advice or guidance. And I know if people want to reach you, you are very easily Googleable, and he is available on LinkedIn at a great price. So I appreciate you coming on today and giving us this advice, which would normally cost you much more than it is right now. Thank you, Richard. So just last bit of advice as we go into this holiday season.
So Nadia, thank you for all your kind words. One, track everything. Almost every issue is foreseeable. Remember, the obviously acts of God or not, but the plaintiff's bar, attorneys general, regulators often have to go onto the internet. So you want to be tracking keywords, and you want to be tracking video. You want to see if there are patterns. If suddenly you see a word such as a chemical that you use suddenly starting to crop up, and it's mentioned by a plaintiff's firm, and then next week by two plaintiffs' firms or an AG, that tells you that's suddenly becoming an issue. You want to be thinking about it. You want to be looking, you're impacting the environment. You want to be looking at the fundraising letters and web pages of environmental organizations to see what they're thinking. Who are your third parties? Who are the high authority third parties? That is people who are respected, who can say positive things about you, but they're also respected by your critics. Knowing them ahead of time, knowing your supply chain, understanding what the issues are, but most important is empowering your teams to be able to have open and honest conversations early. If they don't feel they can tell truth to the executive, if they don't feel that they can take the risk of sharing concerns that they have, then companies will first be inebriated by their own mythology and then shocked and surprised that they are behind not just the curve, but a crushing 8-ball.
Inebriated by their own mythology. Richard Levick, thank you for a masterclass in dealing with the crisis. I'm going to end today by sharing my own masterclass with all of you, and it's around how do you immediately engage or hook an audience. Richard Levick, thank you so much. So what is a hook? A hook is the beginning of your presentation. It's that first couple of minutes. It's the prime real estate. It's in that first couple of minutes that all your audience decides, is this person worth paying attention to, or should I mentally zone out? So whether you are giving a presentation in person or virtually, please remember that there's certain ways that you can immediately grab your audience's attention. You can ask them a question, a statement, a fact. You can tell a story that links into your subject matter, or you can go situation, complication, question, or message. So if we're talking to an audience about working from home and why working from home should be something that we continue to do, I might start off with a story of an employee who we wouldn't otherwise have attracted if they weren't allowed to work from home. Or I could tell you statistically or factually the amount of individuals who would prefer to work from home. Or I might break it into situation, complication, question, message, which is the situation we're in is that the world has changed and people have enjoyed working from home. The complication is we are now forcing people to go back into the workplace. The question is, what can we do to bridge that gap? Well, that's what I'm here to talk to you about. So please think about how you are going to start a presentation and do it in a way that poses a question and says that your presentation is going to answer that question. I'm Nadia, and for more tips and techniques on virtual or in-person presentations, please go onto my website, nadiaspeaks.com.